Theresa Zimmermann clutched the tattered letter in her trembling hands as she stood at the outskirts of Redemption Springs. The town that had once been her home but now felt as foreign and unwelcoming as the vast desert stretching out before her. The summer of 1876 had been unforgiving, scorching the earth beneath her worn boots and blistering her fair skin. But nothing burned quite like the shame that followed her, wherever she went. The whispers had started slowly, like a gentle breeze, but soon transformed into a raging storm that tore through her life, destroying everything she had built. They called her a sinner, a woman of ill repute, a disgrace to the good name of Redemption Springs. But they never bothered to learn the truth. Theresa took one final look at the town behind her. The church steeple pierced the cloudless blue sky, a bitter reminder of the sermon Pastor Wallace had delivered just 3 days prior, a sermon that had sealed her fate. With tears streaming down her face, she turned away from the only home she had ever known and began her lonely journey into the unknown. The stagecoach had refused to take her. "Don't need your kind causing trouble," the driver had muttered, refusing to meet her gaze. So she walked, her meager possessions stuffed into a single bag, the weight of it nothing compared to the burden she carried in her heart. By nightfall, Theresa's feet were blistered and raw. She found shelter beneath an outcropping of rocks, far enough from the main trail to avoid any unwanted encounters. As she huddled against the cold desert night, she allowed herself to cry, truly cry, for the first time since the accusations began. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing except try to help a dying woman deliver her baby. Nothing except fail to save them both, despite working through the night, her hands slick with blood as she fought against fate. Nothing except be unmarried at 24 and skilled in midwifery arts that made the superstitious townsfolk uncomfortable. When the baby died, followed shortly by its mother, the whispers began. Witchcraft, they said. A pact with the devil. A woman who lived alone and delivered babies couldn't possibly be godly. The irony wasn't lost on Theresa that the same women who had once sought her help now crossed the street to avoid her shadow touching them. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by distant coyote calls that seemed to mock her predicament. When dawn broke, Theresa rose stiffly, her body protesting the hard ground and her mind rebelling against the reality of her situation. But she had no choice but to continue. 3 days later, with her supplies dwindling and her hope following suit, Theresa spotted a small homestead in the distance. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and possibly food. She hesitated, knowing all too well how unwelcome she might be, but her growling stomach made the decision for her. As she approached the modest cabin, a tall figure emerged, rifle in hand. The sun was at his back, casting his face in shadow, but his stance was clear. He was not accustomed to unexpected visitors. "That's far enough," his deep voice commanded. "State your business." Theresa stopped, raising her hand slightly to show she meant no harm. "I mean no trouble, sir. I've been traveling for days, and I was hoping for some water, perhaps a bite to eat if you can spare it." The man stepped forward, and Theresa could finally see his face. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, a startling shade of green, assessed her carefully. "Where are you headed?" he asked, lowering his rifle slightly but maintaining his cautious demeanor. "West," Theresa replied simply. It was the only direction that mattered away from Redemption Springs and the cruel whispers that had driven her out. Something in her voice, or perhaps her appearance, must have softened him, for he nodded once and gestured toward the cabin. "There's stew on the fire. You can rest a while before moving on." "Thank you, Mr. Garrett West." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, clearly expecting her to follow. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat for a man living alone on the frontier. A small table with 2 chairs occupied one corner, while a narrow bed took up another. A pot-bellied stove provided both heat and a cooking surface, and it was from this that Garrett ladled a generous portion of stew into a wooden bowl. "Sit," he said, placing the bowl on the table along with a chunk of bread that looked to have been baked that morning. Theresa needed no further invitation. She fell upon the food with an eagerness that would have mortified her mother, God rest her soul. The stew was simple rabbit, she guessed, with wild onions and a few potatoes, but it was the finest meal she'd had in days. Garrett watched her eat without comment, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Only when she'd finished every last morsel did he speak again. "Running from something or toward something?" he asked bluntly. Theresa stiffened. "I don't see how that's any of your concern, Mr. West." A hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "It's not. But in my experience, people don't wander the desert alone unless they're desperate. And desperate people can be dangerous." "I'm not dangerous," Theresa said softly. "Just unwanted." Garrett studied her for a long moment before nodding as if he'd come to some internal decision. "You can stay the night. There's a lean-to out back where I keep supplies. It's not much, but it'll keep you out of the elements." "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go," he replied simply. "Rest. We'll talk more in the morning." True to his word, Garrett provided Theresa with blankets and showed her to the lean-to. It was rudimentary but clean, and after the past few nights spent under the stars, it felt like a palace. As exhaustion claimed her, Theresa's last thought was of the peculiar man with the green eyes who had shown her more kindness in one evening than her neighbors of 20 years had in her final days in Redemption Springs. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster, startling Theresa from a deep, dreamless sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing her heart to race before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was at the homestead of Garrett West, a stranger who had fed her and given her shelter when she needed it most. She emerged from the lean-to to find Garrett already at work, splitting logs with powerful swings of an axe. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm. "There's coffee on the stove," he said by way of greeting. "And eggs if you're hungry." Theresa nodded her thanks and made her way to the cabin. Inside, she found everything as he'd described: a pot of coffee still warm on the stove, and a cast-iron skillet with 3 eggs ready to be cooked. She hesitated only briefly before setting to work, assuming that preparing her own breakfast was the least she could do to repay his hospitality. By the time Garrett entered the cabin, Theresa had not only cooked the eggs but had also straightened up the small living space, washing the few dishes that had been left from the night before and sweeping the floor with a worn broom she'd found in a corner. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly as he took in the changes, but he made no comment as he sat at the table. Theresa placed a plate of eggs before him and poured a cup of coffee, then served herself and took the seat opposite him. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Garrett finally spoke. "You didn't have to do all this. You didn't have to take me in," Theresa countered. "Consider it a small repayment for your kindness." Garrett nodded, accepting her explanation. "So, where are you really headed? West isn't much of a destination." Theresa stared into her coffee cup, considering how much to reveal. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I just needed to leave Redemption Springs." "Redemption Springs," Garrett repeated, his tone sharpening. "That's about 3 days east of here by horse." 4 days on foot, Theresa corrected quietly. Garrett's expression darkened. "You walked from Redemption Springs, alone. That's dangerous country for anyone, let alone a woman by herself. I didn't have much choice. Theresa's voice was barely above a whisper. No one would take me, not after. She trailed off, unwilling to speak the words aloud, to voice the accusations that had been hurled at her by people she'd once considered friends. Garrett watched her for a long moment, his green eyes assessing. After what? Theresa met his gaze squarely. After they decided I was a witch. A startled laugh escaped Garrett before he could stop it. A witch, you? It's not funny, Theresa snapped, rising from the table. A woman died, a woman I was trying to help, her baby too. And because I couldn't save them, because I live alone and practice midwifery, they decided I must be in league with the devil. Garrett's amusement vanished instantly. I'm sorry. You're right, it's not funny. It's a damned tragedy is what it is. Theresa's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen. She sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted despite having just woken up. I don't know what to do now, where to go. I've never been anywhere but Redemption Springs. Garrett was quiet for a long time, seemingly deep in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if he was choosing his words carefully. I need help around here, he said. The place is too much for one person to manage properly. I've been meaning to hire someone, but good help is hard to find in these parts. Theresa stared at him, not quite understanding what he was suggesting. I'm offering you a job, Miss Zimmermann, she supplied. Theresa Zimmermann, Miss Zimmermann. Garrett nodded. You can stay on, help with the cooking and cleaning, maybe tend to the garden out back that I've been neglecting. In exchange, you get room and board, plus a small wage that you can save toward wherever you decide to go next. If you want to, that is. Theresa was speechless. She had expected to be sent on her way after breakfast, back to wandering aimlessly in search of a place that would accept her. The offer of a job of stability, however temporary, was more than she had dared hope for. Why would you do this? She asked, echoing her question from the night before. You still don't know me. Garrett shrugged, a casual gesture at odds with the intensity in his eyes. I'm a good judge of character, always have been. And I don't think you're a witch, Miss Zimmermann. I think you're someone who got caught in a bad situation and needs a helping hand. Besides, I wasn't lying about needing help around here. Theresa considered his offer. She had no plan, no destination in mind. And winter would come, eventually trying to survive alone in the wilderness during the cold months would be nearly impossible. This arrangement would give her time to save money and figure out her next steps. All right, she said finally. I accept. Thank you, Mr. West. Garrett, he corrected. If we're going to be working together, might as well use our given names. Garrett, Theresa repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. And I'm Theresa. He nodded once, decisively, as if sealing their agreement. Welcome to West Ranch, Theresa. It's not much, but it's home. As the days turned into weeks, Theresa settled into life at West Ranch with surprising ease. The lean-to had been transformed into a small but comfortable room of her own, with Garrett adding walls and a proper door to give her privacy. Her days took on a steady rhythm, rising with the sun to prepare breakfast, tending to the garden that was flourishing under her care, cleaning the cabin, and preparing the evening meal before Garrett returned from working the land. For his part, Garrett proved to be a fair employer and a quiet companion. He never pried into her past beyond what she volunteered, and he seemed genuinely appreciative of the improvements she made around the homestead. The cabin, once merely functional, now had touches that made it feel like a home, wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains sewn from fabric she'd found in a trunk, meals that were hearty and varied rather than merely sustaining. It was during the third week of her stay that Theresa learned more about the man who had taken her in. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the desert in hues of gold and crimson, when Garrett suddenly spoke. "I was married once," he said, his voice so quiet that Theresa almost missed it over the evening breeze. "Her name was Sarah. She died 5 years ago, childbirth." Theresa's heart clenched at his words. No wonder he hadn't judged her for failing to save a mother and child. He understood the helplessness, the grief all too well. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "And the child," Garrett shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "didn't make it either. A boy. We were going to name him after my father, Thomas." Theresa reached out instinctively, placing her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. It was the first time they had touched beyond the accidental brushing of fingers when passing dishes or tools, and the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Because of what happened to your wife?" Garrett turned his hand beneath hers, not quite holding it but not pulling away either. "Maybe. Partly. Nobody blamed the midwife when Sarah died. It was just one of those things that happen sometimes. But I know how it feels to lose someone you're trying to save. To wonder if you could have done something differently." They sat in companionable silence after that, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Theresa was acutely aware of his hand beneath hers, of the calluses that spoke of years of hard work, of the gentle strength in his fingers. When she finally withdrew her hand and rose to go inside, Garrett caught her wrist lightly. "You're not a witch, Theresa. You're just a woman who tried to help another woman in need. Don't ever let anyone make you believe differently." His words stayed with her as she prepared for bed that night, wrapping around her heart like a comforting blanket. For the first time since leaving Redemption Springs, Theresa slept without dreams of accusatory faces and pointing fingers. The following day brought unexpected visitors to West Ranch. Theresa was harvesting vegetables from the garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw 3 riders coming up the trail toward the cabin. Her first instinct was to hide a holdover from her hasty departure from town, but she stood her ground, wiping her hands on her apron and waiting to see who these strangers might be. Garrett emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in hand that he casually set aside when he recognized the lead rider. "Thomas, didn't expect to see you out this way." The man called Thomas dismounted with ease despite his considerable age, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he clasped Garrett's hand. "Just checking in on my favorite neighbor and delivering your mail from town." The other 2 riders, a young man who shared Thomas's features and a woman approximately Theresa's age, remained mounted, nodding politely in greeting. Garrett turned and motioned for Theresa to join them. "Thomas, this is Theresa Zimmermann. She's been helping me around the place for the past few weeks. Theresa, this is Thomas Reynolds, his son Paul, and his daughter Olivia." Theresa approached cautiously, nodding to each in turn. "Pleased to meet you." Thomas's eyes twinkled with undisguised curiosity. "Likewise, Miss Zimmermann." Garrett's never mentioned having help before, let alone such pretty help. "Pa," Olivia chided, dismounting gracefully. "Don't embarrass the poor woman." She extended a hand to Theresa, her smile warm and genuine. "Don't mind him. He thinks he's charming." "I am charming," Thomas protested good-naturedly before turning back to Garrett. "We're headed into Silver Creek for supplies. Thought you might want to join us, maybe introduce Miss Zimmermann around town." Theresa froze at the suggestion, her mind immediately conjuring images of more accusations, more whispers. Garrett must have noticed her discomfort, for he smoothly redirected the conversation. "Another time, perhaps. We're in the middle of bringing in the vegetable harvest, and there's still plenty to do before winter sets in." Thomas nodded, accepting the excuse without question. "Well, you're both welcome to join us for Sunday dinner anytime. Martha always makes enough to feed an army." The visitors didn't stay long after that. Just enough time for Thomas to pass along the mail a few letters and a newspaper, and for Olivia to admire Theresa's garden, commenting on how much better it looked than when she'd last visited. As they watched the Reynolds family ride away, Garrett turned to Theresa. "You tensed up when Thomas mentioned going to town." It wasn't a question, but Theresa answered anyway. "I'm not ready to face people yet, not after Redemption Springs." Garrett studied her for a moment before nodding. "Silver Creek isn't Redemption Springs. People here mind their own business for the most part, but there's no rush. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'll go together." The simple promise "we'll go together" warmed Theresa in a way she couldn't quite explain. It had been a long time since anyone had stood beside her, had offered to face the world with her rather than turn against her. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it more than he could possibly know. As autumn progressed, the days grew shorter and the nights cooler. Theresa and Garrett fell into an easy rhythm, their initially tentative interactions evolving into a comfortable companionship. They rarely spoke of the past, neither his marriage nor her expulsion from Redemption Springs, but instead focused on the present, on the daily tasks that kept the ranch running, and the occasional shared moments of quiet conversation. It was during one such evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly long day of preparations for winter, that Garrett broached the subject of her plans. "Winter will be here soon," he said, staring into the dancing flames. "Have you thought about what comes next for you?" Theresa looked up from her mending, a pair of his socks that had worn thin at the heel. The question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Their arrangement had never been intended as permanent. "I haven't," she admitted. "I've been so focused on the present that I haven't given much thought to the future." Garrett nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering. "You've been good for this place," he said after a moment. "For me, too, I think." Theresa felt a blush creep up her neck at his words. It was the closest he'd come to expressing any personal feelings about her presence beyond her value as a worker. "The ranch has been good for me as well," she replied carefully. "I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given me." Garrett turned from the fire to look at her directly, his green eyes reflecting the firelight. "You don't have to leave when winter comes. You could stay on, permanently if you wanted to." Theresa's hand stilled on the sock she was mending. "As your housekeeper, you mean?" Something flickered across Garrett's face, uncertainty, perhaps, or frustration at his own inability to express himself clearly. "As whatever you want to be," he said finally. "I just know that I've grown accustomed to having you here, Theresa. More than accustomed. I look forward to coming back to the cabin and finding you there. I sleep better knowing you're under the same roof. I laugh more than I have in years." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Theresa's heart race. She had been so focused on rebuilding her life, on finding a place where she could exist without judgment, that she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge the growing feelings she harbored for this quiet, steadfast man. "I don't want to be your housekeeper," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to leave either." Garrett set aside the knife he'd been using to whittle a piece of wood, a hobby he pursued in the evenings to keep his hands busy, and moved to kneel before her chair. He took the mending from her hands and set it aside, then captured her fingers in his own. "What do you want, Theresa?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Tell me what you want, and if it's within my power to give it to you, it's yours." Theresa looked into his eyes, seeing the same longing she felt reflected back at her. "I want to belong somewhere," she admitted. "To someone. I want to wake up each morning without fear. I want," she broke off, suddenly afraid to voice her deepest desire. "What?" Garrett prompted gently. "What do you want, she breathed. "I want you, Garrett, but I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands, the tender gesture at odds with the strength she knew those hands possessed. "Afraid that it's too soon. Afraid that you'll wake up one day and regret taking in the witch from Redemption Springs. Afraid that I'll never be able to give you what Sarah did, a chance at a family." Garrett's expression softened at her words. "Theresa, I've had 5 years to mourn Sarah. 5 years to learn to live with the loss. As for regretting taking you in, never. You're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember, and as for a family—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If children come, they come. If they don't, then it will be enough to build a life with you, if you want that too." Tears welled in Theresa's eyes at his declaration. It was more than she had dared to hope for: acceptance, understanding, and the promise of a future unmarred by the shadows of her past. "I do want that," she whispered. "More than anything." Garrett raised one hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as he brushed away a tear with his thumb. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay with me, Theresa, not as my housekeeper, but as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me." Theresa covered his hand with her own, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm. It was their first real touch, the first acknowledgement of the feelings that had been growing between them for weeks. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll be your wife." The smile that broke across Garrett's face was like sunrise after the longest night, brilliant, warm, and full of promise. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Theresa met him halfway. Their first kiss was tender, a gentle press of lips that spoke of reverence and care rather than passion. But as Theresa's arms wound around his neck and his hands found her waist, drawing her closer, the kiss deepened into something more profound: a pledge, a promise, a new beginning. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Never expected to feel this way again." "Nor I," Theresa replied softly. "After everything that happened in Redemption Springs, I thought my life was over. But it was just beginning." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Silver Creek, with Thomas Reynolds and his family as witnesses. The town had welcomed Theresa with surprising warmth, particularly after Garrett made it clear that she was to be his wife. If anyone harbored suspicions about the woman who had appeared so suddenly at West Ranch, they kept them to themselves out of respect for Garrett, who was well regarded in the community. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, the words of commitment exchanged before God and their small circle of new friends binding them together as husband and wife. When the minister pronounced them married and Garrett kissed her, Theresa felt a sense of rightness, of belonging that she had never experienced before, not even in Redemption Springs, where she had lived her entire life until the accusations drove her away. The winter that followed was the happiest of Theresa's life. The ranch became truly their home as they settled into married life, learning each other's habits and preferences, finding joy in the simple daily routine they shared. Garrett taught Theresa how to shoot, a necessary skill on the frontier, and she proved to have a natural talent for it. In turn, she expanded his limited cooking repertoire and introduced small comforts that transformed the once Spartan cabin into a warm, inviting home. They shared their hopes and dreams during the long winter evenings, speaking of expanding the ranch, perhaps adding sheep to the few cattle Garrett already owned. Theresa confessed her desire to eventually use her midwifery skills again, to help women in need as she had once done in Redemption Springs. Garrett supported her completely, his faith in her abilities unwavering. It was on one such evening, as they lay entwined in their bed listening to the wind howling outside, that Theresa finally shared the full story of what had happened in Redemption Springs. She told him about the young woman, barely 18 and unmarried, who had come to her in desperation when her labor began. How the baby had been positioned wrong, how Theresa had worked through the night to try to save them both. How the girl's father, one of the town's most prominent citizens, had arrived just in time to see his daughter and grandchild die, and had immediately accused Theresa of witchcraft, rather than face his own guilt for casting out his pregnant daughter. He needed someone to blame, Theresa said softly, her head resting on Garrett's chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. And I was an easy target, a woman living alone, practicing midwifery without a husband or family to defend me. Garrett's arms tightened around her protectively. That man robbed their town of a gifted healer because of his own pride, he said, anger evident in his voice. They're the ones who should be ashamed, not you. Theresa tilted her head to look up at him, struck once again by the unwavering support he offered her. I used to dream of going back someday, she admitted, of proving them wrong, showing them that I'm not what they accuse me of being. Do you still want that? Garrett asked, his hand moving in soothing circles on her back. Theresa considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. I don't need their approval anymore. I know who I am, and I know that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. Garrett pressed a kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering against her skin. And where is that? Home, Theresa replied simply. With you. When spring arrived, bringing with it new growth and renewal, Theresa discovered that she was expecting their first child. The news filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation, joy at the new life growing within her. Fear, because of the dangers she knew childbirth could pose. Garrett, upon hearing the news, dropped the tool he was holding and swept her into a careful embrace, his face alight with wonder and happiness. A baby, he whispered, one hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. Our baby. Are you happy? Theresa asked, needing to hear his confirmation despite the evidence of his reaction. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Garrett replied, his voice thick with emotion. I'm overjoyed, Theresa, and a little terrified, he admitted with a nervous laugh. Me too, she confessed. But we'll face it together, just as we've faced everything else. As her pregnancy progressed, Theresa found herself thinking more and more about Redemption Springs, not with longing or even anger, but with a strange sense of unfinished business. She had left in shame, driven out by fear and superstition. But now she was Mrs. Garrett West, respected wife of a ranch owner, soon to be a mother. She had built a new life, found love and acceptance when she least expected it. Perhaps it was time to face her past, not to seek approval, but to close that chapter once and for all. She broached the subject with Garrett one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Her condition was now obvious, her rounded belly a visible testament to the life growing within her. I've been thinking about Redemption Springs, she said, her hand absently stroking her stomach where the baby had been particularly active that day. Garrett's expression grew guarded. What about it? I think I want to go back, Theresa said slowly. Not to stay, just to visit. To show them that they didn't destroy me, that I've found happiness despite their cruelty. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Are you sure that's wise in your condition? He asked finally. It's a long journey and you're already 6 months along. We'd go by wagon, Theresa reasoned. And we wouldn't stay long, just long enough for them to see that I'm well, that I'm happy, that I've found a good man who believes in me. Maybe it's foolish, but I feel like I need to do this before the baby comes. Garrett reached for her hand, his expression serious. If it's important to you, then we'll go. But at the first sign that it's too much for you or the baby, we turn around and come home." "Agreed." Theresa squeezed his hand gratefully. "Agreed. Thank you for understanding." 2 weeks later, they set out for Redemption Springs. The journey was indeed long, made longer by frequent stops to allow Theresa to rest. Garrett was attentive to her every need, constantly checking to ensure that she was comfortable and that the jolting of the wagon wasn't causing her undue discomfort. As they approached the town where Theresa had been born and raised, she felt a curious mix of emotions: anxiety, certainly, but also a strange sense of peace. This place had once been everything to her, but now it was just a town like any other. Her true home was with Garrett at their ranch, in the life they were building together. They arrived in Redemption Springs on a Sunday morning, just as church services were concluding. Garrett drew the wagon to a stop in the center of town, helping Theresa down with gentle hands. Her pregnancy was unmistakable now, her belly rounded proudly beneath her best dress. People began to emerge from the church, their conversations dying away as they noticed the strangers in their midst. Or rather, the stranger and the woman who had once been one of them now returned in circumstances none of them could have predicted. Theresa felt the weight of their stares but stood tall, Garrett's supportive hand at the small of her back. She recognized so many faces: women whose babies she had delivered, men who had once tipped their hats to her on the street, the pastor who had condemned her from his pulpit. And there, emerging last from the church, was Harold Blackburn, the father of the girl who had died, the man whose accusations had started it all. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse in the air between Theresa and the townsfolk who had cast her out. It was Mrs. Jensen, the baker's wife whose 3 children Theresa had helped bring into the world, who finally broke the silence. "Theresa," she said, stepping forward hesitantly. "Is that really you?" Theresa nodded, one hand coming to rest protectively on her belly. "It's me, Mrs. Jensen. I've come back to visit." A murmur ran through the crowd at her words. Garrett's hand tightened slightly at her back, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "This is my husband, Garrett West," Theresa continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We have a ranch about 4 days' journey from here. We're expecting our first child in the autumn." More whispers, more exchanged glances. Pastor Wallace stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You seem well, Theresa." "I am well, Pastor," she replied evenly. "Better than well. I'm happy." Harold Blackburn pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face flushed with either anger or shame, perhaps both. "Why have you come back? To gloat? To curse us?" Garrett stiffened beside her, but Theresa placed a restraining hand on his arm. This was her battle to fight. "I came back to show you that you were wrong about me," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed square. "I'm not a witch. I never was. I was just a woman trying to help your daughter when no one else would. I failed, and for that I will always be sorry. But I did not cause her death, and I did not deserve to be driven from my home like a criminal." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many unable to meet her gaze. It was clear that in the months since her departure, doubt had crept in, the initial hysteria giving way to calmer reflection. "I also came back to tell you that I forgive you," Theresa continued, surprising even herself with the words. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger would only poison my happiness. I have a new life now, a good life, with a man who believes in me and a child on the way. I don't need your approval anymore, but I wanted you to know that, despite your best efforts, you didn't break me." Her words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity and truth. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, to Theresa's astonishment, Mrs. Jensen stepped forward and embraced her, careful of her condition. "I'm sorry, Theresa," she whispered. "So many of us are. We were afraid and foolish, and we let fear override our better judgment. One by one, others came forward, not all, but many. They offered hesitant apologies, asked after her health, commented on how well she looked. Even Pastor Wallace approached, his expression humbled. "I was wrong," he said simply. "The Lord teaches us to judge not, lest we be judged, and I failed to heed that teaching." "Can you find it in your heart to forgive an old man's mistake?" Theresa nodded, a weight she hadn't realized she still carried lifting from her shoulders. "I already have, Pastor." Only Harold Blackburn remained aloof, watching the proceedings with a stony expression before turning and walking away without a word. But even his rejection couldn't diminish the sense of closure Theresa felt. They stayed in Redemption Springs for 2 days, accepting the hospitality of Mrs. Jensen, who insisted they take her spare room rather than stay at the hotel. Theresa visited her old home, now occupied by a young couple with 2 small children, and found that she could look upon it with fondness rather than pain. She walked through the town, arm in arm with Garrett, no longer the outcast but a visitor receiving smiles and nods of greeting. On the morning of their departure, a small crowd gathered to see them off. Gifts were pressed upon them, a hand-knitted blanket for the baby, preserves and baked goods for the journey, small tokens of regret and reconciliation. As Garrett helped her up onto the wagon seat, Theresa took one last look at the town that had once been her entire world. She felt no regret, no longing to stay. Redemption Springs was her past. Garrett, the baby growing within her, their ranch that was her future. "Ready to go home?" Garrett asked softly, taking his place beside her. Theresa nodded, leaning into his solid presence. "Yes, let's go home." The journey back to West Ranch was slower than their trip to Redemption Springs, as Theresa's condition necessitated even more frequent stops and shorter days of travel. But neither minded the pace. There was a contentment between them, a sense of having overcome something significant together. They arrived home on a perfect autumn day, the ranch looking welcoming and familiar after their absence. As Garrett helped Theresa down from the wagon, she paused to take in the sight of their home, the cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. Thomas Reynolds had been looking after things in their absence. The garden still producing vegetables, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. "It's good to be back," she said, squeezing Garrett's hand. "It's good to have you back," came a voice from the direction of the barn. Thomas emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "How was your journey?" "Enlightening," Garrett replied, clapping his old friend on the shoulder. "Thank you for watching over the place." "My pleasure. Martha sent over some food, it's in the cabin. Said you'd be tired from the road and shouldn't have to cook right away." Thomas's eyes twinkled as he looked at Theresa's prominent belly. "That little one's growing fast. Won't be long now." Theresa smiled, placing a hand on her stomach where the baby was kicking energetically. "Another month or so, we think." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Well, you get some rest. Dr. Wilson's back in Silver Creek now, good man, trained back east. I told him about you, that you might be needing him soon. He said to send word when the time comes." Theresa exchanged a look with Garrett. They had discussed this during their journey home, the possibility of having the doctor present for the birth. Given what had happened with Sarah, Garrett's anxiety about the delivery was understandable. "Thank you, Thomas," Theresa said warmly. "That's very thoughtful." After Thomas took his leave, Garrett and Theresa entered their cabin together. Everything was just as they had left it, with the addition of Martha Reynolds's generosity evident in the covered dishes on the table. But something had changed, or rather, something had been completed. The journey to Redemption Springs had closed a circle, allowing Theresa to fully embrace her present without the shadows of the past hanging over her. No regrets?" Garrett asked as if reading her thoughts, his arms encircling her from behind, his hands coming to rest on her belly where their child grew. Theresa leaned back against him, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence. "None," she said with certainty. "Everything that happened, even being driven out of Redemption Springs, led me to you. How could I regret that?" Garrett pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I thank God for it every day," he admitted quietly. "For bringing you to my door that night, for giving me the sense to offer you a place to stay, for giving me a second chance at love when I thought that part of my life was over." Theresa turned in his embrace, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "And I thank God for giving me the courage to keep walking, even when I had no idea where I was going, for leading me to you." Their daughter, Sarah Theresa West, was born on a crisp November morning with Dr. Wilson in attendance. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when Theresa finally held her child in her arms, the love that flooded her heart was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Garrett, who had paced anxiously outside the cabin during the birth, entered with tentative steps when the doctor called him in. The sight of his wife, exhausted but radiant, cradling their newborn daughter left him speechless with emotion. "Come meet your daughter," Theresa said softly, shifting the swaddled infant so Garrett could see her tiny face. With reverent hands, Garrett took the baby from Theresa, cradling her against his chest with a natural ease that belied his initial nervousness. "She's perfect," he whispered, awestruck. "So small but so perfect." "Sarah," Theresa said, watching the play of emotions across her husband's face. "After your first wife, if that's all right with you." Garrett looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You would do that. She was important to you," Theresa replied simply. "And without her, without your love for her, you might not have understood what happened in Redemption Springs. You might not have taken me in that night. Sarah Theresa West, to honor both our pasts and celebrate our future together." Garrett leaned down to kiss her, a kiss of such tenderness and gratitude that words became unnecessary. When he finally pulled away, he carefully returned their daughter to Theresa's arms before sitting on the edge of the bed, one arm around his wife's shoulders, the other hand gently stroking his daughter's downy head. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he confessed. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. I resigned myself to living alone, to never having the family we'd planned. And I never thought I would find a place where I truly belonged," Theresa replied. "Even in Redemption Springs, I was always somewhat apart, the midwife, living alone, not quite fitting in. But with you, from the very beginning, I felt like I had come home." They sat together in contented silence, marveling at the tiny life they had created, the perfect blend of both of them. Sarah had Garrett's green eyes and, Theresa was certain, her own determined chin. She was their miracle, the embodiment of the love that had grown between two wounded souls who found healing in each other. As the years passed, West Ranch flourished under their joint care. Garrett expanded their herds, adding sheep as they had discussed during that first winter together. Theresa, once baby Sarah was old enough, began to practice midwifery again, her reputation spreading throughout the region as a skilled and compassionate birth attendant. Women came from as far as Silver Creek to seek her help, and this time, there were no whispers of witchcraft, only gratitude and respect. Sarah grew into a strong, curious child with her father's quiet confidence and her mother's healing hands. When she was 3, she was joined by a brother, Thomas Garrett West, named for both Garrett's father and their dear friend Thomas Reynolds, who had been such a support to them from the beginning. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were droughts that threatened their livestock, harsh winters that tested their endurance. the ordinary challenges of raising children in a place where nature could be both bountiful and cruel. But through it all, Theresa and Garrett faced each challenge together, their love deepening with each passing year. They never returned to Redemption Springs, though occasionally news would reach them through travelers or merchants. The town had changed, they heard. A new doctor had settled there, bringing modern ideas and challenging old superstitions. Pastor Wallace had retired, replaced by a younger man with more progressive views. Harold Blackburn had passed away, a bitter and lonely man to the end. None of it mattered much to Theresa anymore. Redemption Springs was a chapter in her life that had closed the day she and Garrett drove away, heading home with their unborn daughter growing within her. She had found her redemption not in the town that bore that name, but in the love of a quiet, steadfast man who had seen her worth when others saw only suspicion and fear. On the 10th anniversary of the day Theresa had first stumbled upon West Ranch, exhausted and desperate, Garrett surprised her with a gift, a sign, carefully carved and painted, to hang beside their front door. It read simply, "West Ranch founded on faith, built with love." "Because that's what you brought here," Garrett explained as Theresa ran her fingers over the smooth wood, tracing the letters he had carved with such care. "Faith, when mine was faltering. Love, when I thought I'd never feel it again." Theresa's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "And you gave me a home when I had none," she said softly. "A place to belong when I thought I would never belong anywhere again." Garrett wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close as they had stood countless times over the years in joy and sorrow, in hardship and plenty. "I think we saved each other," he murmured against her hair. "And together, we built something neither of us could have built alone." From the distance came the sound of children's laughter, Sarah and Thomas returning from collecting eggs, a daily chore they treated as an adventure. Soon, they would burst through the door, full of stories and observations, seeking their parents' attention and approval. "Yes," Theresa agreed, leaning into her husband's embrace as they waited for their children to join them. "Together, we built everything that matters." The town had driven her out for an imagined sin, but a cowboy had driven her home with pride. And in that home, built on understanding and acceptance, Theresa Zimmermann West had found not just shelter, but belonging. Not just survival, but joy. Not just forgiveness, but love enduring, steadfast love that had transformed a hasty departure into the most fortunate journey of her life.